EQ is actually much simpler than they want you to think. But do you actually need to EQ your voiceover? First of all, EQ is short for equalizer or equalization, and I'm only really going to talk about the features of EQ you need to know for voiceover, although I will touch on other things here and there. Oops. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the science of sound, but Hertz is the unit of frequency of sound, named after the German physicist Heinrich Hertz. You'll almost always see it abbreviated to HZ, that's uppercase H, lowercase z, and in the world of recording you'll often hear talk of kilohertz as well, which is 1000 hertz. Audio is metric, kids, so yes, you can have megahertz, gigahertz, terahertz, but don't worry about that for now. You'll probably also hear audio engineers drop the word hertz altogether and just talk about a frequency of 1K or 16K, for example. And what they mean is 1 kilohertz or 16 kilohertz. By the way, at the end, I'll give you a rundown of how different frequencies affect the sound of the human voice. As humans, we hear the frequency of sound as pitch, and every note in music has an exact frequency. So without getting too technical about music theory, if you look at a piano keyboard, every single note on that keyboard has a unique frequency in hertz. For example, the lowest note on a piano is A0, which has a frequency of 27.5 hertz, and the highest note is C8 at 4186.01 hertz, and middle C has a frequency of 261.626 hertz. Now, this knowledge can come in extremely useful, especially when you're EQing music. But even more useful is the fact that for every octave in music, that's every 12 notes, for example, A0, A1, A2, etc., the frequency is doubled as you go up and halved as you go down. So A0 is 27.5 hertz. A1 is 27.5 times 2, which is 55 hertz. A2 is 55 times 2, which is 110 hertz, etc., etc., etc. And this works for every note in music and is extremely powerful knowledge. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use Reaper's free native equalizer plugin, ReaEQ. Your EQ plugin might look a bit different, but all the features and all the principles are exactly the same. So, open up Reaper. I've got my empty track here, and one way you can add effects is to right-click over the FX button, and we'll go to Categories, EQ, and select ReaEQ. I'll make it a bit bigger so you can see it better. Now, the range of human hearing falls between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz or 20 kHz, and that's the range you can see on the graph here in ReaEQ, with 20 Hz on the left and 20,000 Hz or 20K on the right. So you have frequency going from left to right, and gain, or how loud a frequency is, going from bottom to top with 0 on the center line. Each frequency is also called a band, and you can have as many bands as you like in ReaEQ, but the default is 5 when you open it for the first time. The first 4 are already enabled, and they all have a band type selected by default. I'll explain what all of the band types do in a minute, but for now, I'm going to select Band 2 and talk you through the controls. The first slider controls frequency. It shows you the frequency in hertz, it's set to 300 Hz by default, as well as the musical note that frequency is closest to, in this case D4, which is really useful if you're EQing music. And if you slide it up and down, you can see that frequency changes and the little red dot moves around on the graph. So let's return the frequency to 300 Hz for now. But you're not affecting the audio just yet. To do that, you need to use the gain control. The second slider controls the gain, or how loud a frequency is, and that's measured in decibels, or dB. By default, it's set to 0, so nothing is actually being affected yet. But if you slide it up and down, you can see how the gain increases and decreases, and you can see on the graph how that change is taking effect. When you increase the gain, that is what's known as a boost. This is a 300 Hz boost. And when you decrease the gain, this is what's known as a cut. This is a 300 Hz cut. Let's leave it at about 6 dB for the next bit. The third slider controls bandwidth. What on earth is bandwidth, I hear you ask? Bandwidth, which is also sometimes called Q or the Q factor, meaning quality factor, is simply how wide or how narrow you want your frequency range to be. This is measured in octaves. Remember how we talked about octaves earlier? And it's set to 2 octaves by default because that gives you a nice starting range in the shape of a bell curve. It's called that because it looks like a bell, which you can see on the graph. So if you slide the bandwidth up, you can see on the graph how the frequency range increases. And if you slide the bandwidth down, you can see how the frequency range decreases. This is how you can get pinpoint precision with low bandwidth or big, sweeping changes with high bandwidth. Now, the secret to good EQing is to try to keep all those curves nice and smooth so that nothing changes too dramatically. Unless that's what you need to do, of course. Before we move on, let's have a quick look at that drop-down menu with all the different band types. Now, you'll probably never need to use most of these, but I'll show you what they do anyway. Basically, they each give you a different type of curve for your frequency filter, which you'll see on the graph. I've set everything to 1000 Hz with 1 octave of bandwidth and 60 dB of gain. So, low shelf gives you a low shelf, where all the frequencies below your selection are boosted or cut with the same gain. High shelf does the same thing, but all the frequencies above your selection are boosted or cut with the same gain. Band is the one you'll use the most, and is the one that gives you that nice bell curve with great bandwidth control. Low pass only allows low frequencies to pass through and cuts off everything above your selection. Gain has no effect on this. High pass only allows high frequencies to pass through and cuts off everything below your selection. Gain has no effect on this either. More about this one in a moment. All pass doesn't actually do anything. It just lets all the frequencies pass through. Notch gives you a very deep cut at your selected frequency, and gain has no effect on this one either. Band pass only lets your chosen frequency pass through and cuts everything above and below that frequency, and gain has no effect on this. Parallel bandpass does the same thing as bandpass, but does it in parallel rather than in series, which would be really getting into the weeds, and I'm not going into that here because we don't need to. And you also won't need the band Alt and band Alt 2 at the bottom there, which just use slightly different mathematical formulae to create the curve, and I am not getting into mathematics. Sorry. ReaEQ is what's known as a parametric EQ, which means that you can change its parameters. You might also see a graphic EQ. Graphic EQs work in exactly the same way, but they have fixed frequencies and a fixed bandwidth curve for each frequency, so you can only change the gain. But the principles are exactly the same. Now, you've probably been told at some point that you need to use an HPF, or high pass filter. What on earth is a high pass filter, I hear you ask? Well, it's this. It cuts the lowest frequencies and only lets the higher frequencies pass through, hence the name high pass filter. Although it would be much easier if it was called a low cut filter. Let's go back to ReaEQ and click band 1. If you look at the band type, you can see that it's set by default to low shelf. This is great if you just want to boost or cut the bottom end, but we want to eliminate all of the bottom end of our audio. So click the drop-down menu and select high pass. The high pass filter in ReaEQ is just called high pass, and the frequency is set to 100 Hz by default, which is perfect for our purposes. But we need to get rid of that boost there. That's no good to us. And for that, we need to use the bandwidth slider. As you drag the slider up, you can see that boost decreasing. And once you hit 2 octaves, which happens to be this marker here, we are all done and you're good to go. You can see how it eliminates absolutely everything in a smooth curve below 100 Hz. Now you might take that down to 70 Hz or even 50 Hz later down the line depending on your setup, but for now 100 Hz is fine. The beauty of the high-pass filter and its whole function in VoiceOver is that it gets rid of any rumbling low-frequency noise that you can't actually hear. You might get noise from your microphone. You might get noise from your audio interface. You might get noise from a bus driving past outside, or the washing machine downstairs, or the aircon. I don't have aircon in here, I wish I did. These are all sounds happening all the time in the world around you that you can't hear, but your microphone can. And cutting out anything below 100 Hz makes all that just disappear. Now, here's the part most EQ tutorials skip, and it might be why your EQ isn't working quite as well as you'd like. You see, when you're recording voice on its own, there's really not much you should do with your audio in terms of EQ. If you've recorded a good environment and you're speaking well with good mic technique, and, well, there's not much else you should have to do. In fact, the majority of my clients don't even want me to EQ my voice. They do that on their end so that it fits in perfectly with their music bed or their audio track. So when it comes to EQing your voice, my advice is this: use your ears. Don't use preset EQ settings just because someone says you should. Not even me. Your ears are the best tool you have. Don't go changing your EQ if you don't need to. But if you listen to your recording and something sounds off, then give it a little EQ by all means. The first thing you need to do is find the offending frequencies. Now, over time, you'll get used to which sounds are linked to which frequencies, and at the end of the video, I'll give you a list of the most common. But for now, the best thing to do is to listen carefully and watch the EQ graph. Have a listen to this recording I made a while ago. From small beginnings to large partnerships, together we shape the future of industrial construction. We are doers. We plan and develop. We produce, store, deliver, and assemble. I don't remember the circumstances, but something was obviously a bit wrong. There seemed to be a few rogue frequencies running around. Okay, first things first, I'm going to add a high-pass filter to get rid of that low-end noise that I can see, even though I can't actually hear it. From small beginnings to large partnerships, together we shape the future of industrial construction. Next, it's sounding really boxy around the high mids. That's the higher end of the mid-range frequencies, around the 1 kHz to 3 kHz range. And I can see on ReaEQ that there's something jumping around just under 2K. Small beginnings to large partnerships. Together we shape the future of industrial construction. Now, a great trick here is to lower the bandwidth to around 0.2 octaves and then lift the gain to about 9 decibels, which is total overkill. But you can then use the frequency slider to move around, and that exaggerated boost tells your ears exactly where that nasty sound is coming from. From small beginnings to large partnerships, together we shape the future of industrial construction. We are doers. We plan and develop. We produce, store. So that sounds like it's somewhere around 1,500 Hz. It's quite an extreme frequency, so I think I'll drop the gain to about -6 dB, and that should cut that out nicely. Now there's another nasty thing I can hear that seems to be down at around the 200 to 300 Hz range. Sounds like I had a bit of a cold that day. So repeat the same process. Say 250 Hz, 9 decibels gain, 0.2 octaves bandwidth. From small beginnings to large partnerships. And I think I've hit the nail on the head there. Again, it's quite annoying, so a gain reduction of about -dB. From small beginnings to large partnerships. And it sounds good. Just one more thing to do here. Now, band 4 is set to high shelf by default. Now, you don't need to do much here, and if you overdo this, you can ruin the audio, but a nice, gentle 1 decibel lift right at the top end can add a little sparkle to your recording as well. From small beginnings to large partnerships, together we shape the future of industrial construction. But like I said, just don't overdo it. Just 1 decibel is enough. This adds a nice bit of air to your audio that can lift it and give it a lease of life. So, how do you know whether to cut or boost and which frequencies am I looking for? Well, the most important thing about EQ is that you should always choose to cut rather than boost if you can. Cut the frequencies you don't want, don't boost the frequencies you do want. And you should always do it gently. A good rule of thumb is to cut or boost by around 3 dB at a time with a nice, narrow bell curve. And here are some useful frequencies to start with. For the human voice, you really shouldn't need anything below 100 Hz. That's why we use a high-pass filter. Around 200 Hz is where you'll often find an annoying boom. This is usually where you get the horrible head cold sound we had earlier. 800 to 1000 Hz is the tricky balance between clarity and nasality. Not enough, and some words may be unintelligible, but too much, and it sounds like you're talking through your nose. Around 3000 Hz or 3K, you get presence, the nice buzz in your voice. Not enough, and you may sound a bit deflated or flat and dull, but too much, and your listener might feel like they're being poked in the ear with a stick. 4000 to 8000 Hz is where your sibilants live. This is the range in which you hunt for any rogue S sounds. And 10,000 Hz and over is basically just air. This is the high shelf sparkle we added last. It's not always necessary though, and simply adding air for the sake of it can make your audio sound harsh and brittle, and can also introduce unwanted noise, so be careful with this. So, do you actually need to EQ your voiceover? Well, yes. Yes, you do. At least a little bit, anyway. And if you want to know the next step in your effects chain, check out this video here. And like and subscribe.